Okay, mental note to self. Next time we read Matthew 22, let's not do it on a Sunday when the kids are reading Scripture. Those of you who are parents, listen carefully to this sermon, because you should bring this up again to your kids afterwards. You should talk to them about what this Scripture lesson is about. Nobody ever says, "What's your favorite Scripture lesson?" And a whole bunch of people say, "Matthew 22. Ooh, I just love 1 to 14 especially. When that guy gets bound and thrown out to the outskirts where there is wailing and the gnashing of teeth. Or as a friend of mine used to say, gnashing of teeth. When was the last time you gnashed your teeth? Wake up, you're gnashing your teeth. It's bothering my sleep. No? This is a horrific story and hard to wrestle with. We are so attuned to believing that the allegories, the parables of Jesus, are easily matched up with this character is God, or this character is Jesus, and this character is us, and all that kind of stuff. Got to be careful not to do that with every parable. Even the parables that are described that way, we can know not necessarily Jesus didn't give that explanation. So, got to be careful, because sometimes Jesus told a parable and a story to get a point across, but each character doesn't match up perfectly. I certainly would not want our God to be compared to the king in this scripture lesson. Not all the actions, anyway. There are extremes on both sides of this story. There's a king with a son who's getting married, and the king decides to hold a banquet, and I don't know why, but the people invited don't want to come. There's an urgency to this story. Just hear that right at the beginning. How do you know there's an urgency? Because the king says, go out and get the people who've been invited, because the oxen and fatted calf have been slaughtered. No problem in Saskatoon in the wintertime, but in first century Palestine, you got to get those animals eaten soon. They could only be kept indoors in a cool house or in a dugout, maybe in a cold room. I didn't know what they did to keep things cool, but only so long, and they would have to be eaten. So the urgency, the panic of the story is the animals have already been slaughtered. And so it makes sense that you wait to slaughter the animals, and then you get the people who've already been invited to come. And they said no. And I loved Anna's tone when she read that. She's like, one to their business, one to their farm, you know. And then the others step up. Some of them just went back to the business and the farm. The others are like beaten, tortured, and murdered slaves who came. The poor slaves. This is not the only time in Scripture where the slaves get killed. It's not pleasant. Nobody wants to be a slave in first century Palestine. Nobody wants to be a slave. So they get killed. But then there's an extreme reaction from the king. And I love, in the 4-day period or whenever you have to get that meat eaten, there's still time to send troops out to ransack and burn the village and kill those who had transgressed. Which seems counterproductive, because that village and those farms and the people who own them would have been working for the king through taxation. So kind of cutting yourself off, cutting one foot off or something. It seemed a little odd. But that's the counter-reaction. So those who were invited originally kill the messengers. Then there's a counter-reaction, and their town gets burned down. And then they regroup, and the king says, go out and invite anybody, the good and the bad. Get them off the streets. Bring them in. We're going to have a feast. The show must go on. So everybody is invited from the streets, the good, the bad, and the very ugly. And they come in, and they are enjoying the feast. And then what happens? The king is mingling and milling about and sees the one guy who doesn't have the appropriate wedding garment on. And in what seems to us to be a grave injustice and a horror, he gets bound and taken out to the outskirts. I always wondered what that place looked like in first century Palestine. How far outside of town was the place of wailing and gnashing of teeth? I'd love to go back in time and see. Well, I don't want to go near it, but I just want to know what that looked like. So he's bound, and I don't have any images for this because it's a horrific story, but there is one image on Google. You can look at it where the guy is bound and he's being carried off by by the slaves, the servants, are throwing him out, turfing him out. He's not just sent out to wailing and gnashing of teeth. He's bound and sent out to gnashing and wailing of teeth. This guy's not going to last very long. As one scholar reminded me this week, we could talk back to Matthew in the telling of this story. You're allowed to talk back to Scripture. You know that from my preaching. We can ask big questions. We could say, I don't know, Matthew, that's pretty extreme. I mean, one of the problems is, and it's gotten worse and worse every week, Matthew does not write or speak or preach or storytell in pastels. The same story is told in Luke, if you want the softer version. Luke, gentle soul. Not Matthew. It was in Matthew first, probably. And he predates Luke's writing. And it's tough. And we're getting tougher and tougher. Jesus in Matthew seems to be getting harder and harder and harder. Last week it was, those who are first shall be last, those who are last shall be first. Boom, mic drop. This week is, many are called, but few are chosen. Boom. Right? Jesus is getting tough. Matthew is just ramping it up. And there's this sense of urgency, this sense of panic, and this sense of very deliberate focus, and also judgment. No pastels, bold screaming colors for Matthew in describing Jesus' ministry and Jesus' stories. I would ask, first and foremost, who is Matthew actually preaching against in this text? Is it me? Is it you? Well, in the original scripture lesson, it seems that the audience are the Pharisees and the chief priests, because this actually follows Matthew 21. We'll get to it later this season, but Jesus has gone into the temple, the Parade of Palms, and turned the tables over, and has already been screaming at the chief priests and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So Jesus is speaking with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, in his company. And he's continuing to speak against them. And in Matthew, this is really important because, as I've mentioned, Matthew's disciples, 80 AD, 70 AD, they were trying to become the leadership of the Jewish church. They believed they were the one true Jewish church, the followers of Jesus, because he was the fulfillment of Scripture. So the Sadducees wanted to be in leadership. The Pharisees wanted to be in leadership. The Sanhedrin had often been in leadership. And this little discipleship of Jesus, they were trying to make their way into the leadership of the Jewish church because they believed they were the ones who had the answers. So this is some inner religious political jostling as well in the way that Matthew tells this. They're fighting for legitimacy. But also, Matthew understands the magnitude of the love being offered. We cannot lose this. The high drama, the tension, the conflict, all comes from a writer and a preacher who remembers the love Jesus brought and the magnitude of it. The feast is the note for that. We are sent in the direction of God's wondrous love by knowing that the setting is a feast. Feasts weren't used often for images in the Old and New Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures and our Gospel. But when they were used as symbols of great abundance, images of God's wondrous, no matter what, love. So they're at a feast, and you've got to understand the people who were hearing this parable from Jesus were starving. They were not people who got to feast very often. And so imagine the first century audience. Jesus is preaching this parable. There was a great feast given by a king. And they can almost feel it in their mouths. The abundance of God's love that's seen in a feast that will last 4 days. Matthew fully understands the immensity, the incomprehensible mystery and wonder of God's love, because he sets this at a feast where it's just the abundance is constant. A magnitude of grace and love and abundance that most of the people hearing this had never known. But it ends badly. This one guy gets picked out and he doesn't have the wedding garment on. And he gets turfed. And there's been years of preaching on this where it's like, well, that guy wasn't faithful enough. He wasn't living out God's ways enough. Therefore, he's being turned out. No, he was invited in. He was part of the kingdom. If this banquet is like the kingdom, he's already in. Our temptation over the years has been to make this scripture and see it like Pharisees would see it, which is some are in, some are out. But Jesus is preaching against the Pharisees. So it's not about who's in and who's out. It's actually a scripture about who's prepared, who's ready to be changed, who's open to the love that is experienced in the kingdom through Jesus. You may say, well, he was rushed. The guy didn't even know he was going to a wedding that day. How could he have his appropriate wedding robe? But everybody else who was picked off the street had their garments on. No excuse. Then we found out, just this very moment, this morning it came to me through a wiser person that I live with. Deb and I were working this scripture lesson together yesterday and today. And that's where the people in Canadian Tire who are talking about Matthew 22 as we're shopping. And guess what? In the Oriental tradition, in Middle Eastern tradition, in the first century, the practice was that the groom provided garments for everybody at the wedding. Especially kings and princes. They had wardrobes filled with thousands of garments for every occasion. So everybody was invited off the street, the good and the bad, would be queued up in a line, and they would go by and they would be given appropriate wedding garments. Now you know what's up. The guy decided not to wait in line. He decided he wouldn't want to wear the garments. There was something going on with this fella, that he remained indifferent in the face of God's abundant love. That's the image. Much like the original invitees who they were indifferent and they just decided to go back to their farm and their business. This guy actually is welcomed in and made it through the doors. But decided not to dig in. Decided not to care enough about what was being received. Didn't even put on the garment. Out he goes. When I was training in chaplaincy many years ago in Halifax, I was working at the infirmary hospital. It's no longer there. And I remember our chaplaincy teacher saying this: when you walk into a hospital room as a chaplain, you better know why you're there. You better know why you're there. Because if you walk in and you're uncertain what your role is at that bedside, it can get pretty messy pretty fast. First of all, if you have a cross or some symbol of religion and you walk in and say, "Hi, I'm the chaplain," but you're not sure why you're there, first thing a person might assume is you've come to tell them the bad news. But more than that, it can just get really emotionally fuzzy. If you as a chaplain walk in and you're nervous about your own presence there, if you are uncomfortable with death, if you are uncomfortable with the illness or the smell, or what the person looks like, are they disfigured, what's happening? If you're not sure what you're doing in that room, don't go in, the supervisor said. Take a moment in between each room, go into the stairwell, make a few notes, say a prayer, breathe, do whatever you have to do. But when you walk into that room, you be darn sure you know what your role is at that bedside. It's about intention. It's about how do you hold the holy, and are you ready for what's going to happen? That's what this parable is about. We've all been invited, and we're all going in, and we're all there. We know God's love. You all know God's love. I've been telling you about it for 17 years. Even if you only listened to me twice in those 17 years, you know what God's love is about. But more than that, because you know what life is like, and you have lived and received God's great, abundant, wondrous love. The Lenten question is, are you remaining indifferent? Is your heart actually open to that wondrous love? Or are you like, meh. That's the Christian condition, I'd have to say. Oh, we're churchy, but we're kind of like, yeah, we heard about it. And Reverend Dave says we've experienced it, but we're not going to do much about it. I say, just like the choir said it already, that was a whole sermon right there. Get dressed for the wedding. Receive what's been offered. Receive what's been offered. And get ready for more. Get ready for more. We'd say back home, fish or cut bait, folks. One or the other. Fish or cut bait. But don't just sit on the shore waiting, thinking the fish are going to jump in. Just, oh, I don't like water anymore, I like air. I'm going to jump into that person's plot. Got to do one or the other, fish or cut bait. We got to put on our wedding garments. We got to get ready and show God that we are thankful for what we've been given. May it be so. Amen.